What most people misunderstand about empaths who choose solitude is that they think it's about being antisocial, broken, or afraid of people. It isn't. It's the opposite. It's what happens when someone feels everything so deeply that being around the wrong energy doesn't just annoy them, it costs them. Most people can walk through a room full of tension, gossip, fake smiles, and low-grade chaos and barely notice. They go home, they forget about it, they sleep fine. An empath walks through that same room and absorbs it. The tension lodges in their chest. The fake smile replays in their mind at 2 a.m. The unspoken resentment in someone's voice becomes a weight they carry for days, even though it was never theirs to carry. So somewhere along the way, the empath learns something most people never have to learn, that not all environments are safe for their nervous system. Not all relationships are worth the emotional tax. Not all company is better than no company. And once they learn that lesson, they don't become cold or distant by accident. They become deliberate. They start making quiet decisions, almost invisible from the outside, that protect their inner world. And the strange irony is this: the more they protect that inner world, the more peaceful, grounded, and even magnetic they become. People sense it. They say, "There's something different about you." What's different is that the empath stopped performing connection and started choosing it. This isn't a story about loneliness. It's a story about restoration. Because an empath who lives alone isn't hiding from the world. They're recovering from it on their own terms, so that when they do show up for someone, it's real, full, and uncontaminated by exhaustion or resentment. But here's what makes this powerful: it isn't random. It isn't just introversion or bad luck with people. There are specific things, 3 specific things, that an empath starts doing once they understand themselves. And once they start doing these 3 things, solitude stops feeling like absence. It starts feeling like home. Today, we're going to walk through exactly what those 3 things are, why they change everything, and what they reveal about emotional self-respect that most people never learn in a lifetime. There was a time when every empath did this same thing. They explained themselves. Someone would ask why they left the party early, why they didn't answer the phone, why they needed a weekend with no plans, and out would come the apology disguised as an explanation. "Sorry, I'm just tired. Sorry, I just need a minute. Sorry, it's not you. I just always sorry," always justifying, as if needing space was a debt they owed an explanation for instead of a basic requirement for staying sane. And here's the quiet tragedy in that pattern. Every time an empath explains their need for space, they're not just informing someone. They're asking for permission. They're checking somewhere underneath the words whether it's okay that they're built this way, whether they're allowed to step back without being seen as cold, distant, dramatic, or difficult. And when you spend years asking permission to protect yourself, you start to believe, somewhere deep down, that your peace is negotiable, that it's up for debate, that if someone pushes back hard enough or looks hurt enough or asks why one more time, you should probably just cave and show up anyway, exhausted, depleted, resentful, but present. This is where everything starts to shift, because the empaths who finally find peace in solitude are not the ones who got better at explaining themselves. They're the ones who stopped needing to. There's a specific moment, and if you're an empath, you might recognize it when you say, "I need some time alone," and you don't follow it with a reason. You don't soften it with 3 sentences of context. You don't manage the other person's potential disappointment before it's even happened. You just say it, and you let it stand on its own, the same way you'd say, "I'm going to bed," or "I'm getting some water." No drama, no defense, just a fact about what you need. That moment feels almost rebellious the first time it happens, because for so long, your nervous system has been trained to believe that other people's comfort matters more than your own regulation. You've absorbed the unspoken rule that being a good friend, a good partner, a good family member means being endlessly available, endlessly flexible, endlessly willing to bend your own limits so nobody else has to feel inconvenienced. And for an empath specifically, that rule is dangerous because you don't just feel your own exhaustion. You feel everyone else's reaction to your boundaries too. You feel their disappointment land in your body like it's your own. So saying no and meaning it without immediately trying to fix how it makes someone else feel is one of the hardest and most necessary skills an empath ever develops. What changes once you stop explaining isn't just your words, it's your relationship with guilt. Guilt thrives on negotiation. It needs you to keep talking, keep justifying, keep offering reasons, because every reason you give is another opening for someone to argue with you. But it's just one dinner. But you've had all weekend to recharge. But I really need you there. If you're in the business of explaining, you're in the business of being talked out of your own needs. But the moment you simply state what you need and let it exist without defending it, you take away the entry point. There's nothing to argue with. You said you need space. That's the whole sentence. It doesn't require a courtroom. This is also where self-respect quietly rebuilds itself, piece by piece. Every time you protect your need for space without over-explaining, you send yourself a message that your needs are valid on their own, without external approval. You stop outsourcing your sense of okay-ness to other people's reactions. And the wild part is this doesn't make your relationships worse. It usually makes them better. Because the people who actually care about you don't need 3 paragraphs of justification. They just need to know what you need. And the people who do need 3 paragraphs, who do push back, who do make you feel guilty for stepping away. Watching how they react to a simple, undefended boundary tells you everything about whether that relationship was built on respect or built on your constant availability. Over time, this becomes less of a discipline and more of an instinct. You stop rehearsing what you'll say before you say it. You stop bracing for the reaction. You start trusting that your need for space doesn't make you difficult, it makes you someone who knows themselves. And once that belief settles in, solitude stops feeling like something you have to defend. It becomes something you simply live inside of calmly, without apology, the same way you breathe without asking anyone if it's all right. That single shift, choosing protection over explanation, is often the very first crack in the wall between an empath who is constantly drained by the world and an empath who has finally learned how to come home to themselves. Most people think selectivity is about who you spend time with. For an empath, it goes much deeper than that. It's not about who gets invited to dinner or who's on the group chat. It's about who gets to reach the inside of you. The part that feels things before it understands them, the part that absorbs a mood the second someone walks into a room. And once an empath realizes that not everyone deserves access to that part of them, something fundamental changes. They stop treating emotional access like something that's automatically granted by closeness, time, or history. They start treating it like something that has to be earned. This is a hard shift, because most of us are raised to believe that emotional openness is a virtue you give freely. That being a good person means being available, transparent, and emotionally generous with everyone who asks for it. For an empath, this belief becomes a kind of slow erosion, because they don't just listen to someone's problems. They take them on. They don't just notice someone's sadness. They carry it home with them, replay it, feel it pressing on their own chest hours later. So if they keep handing out emotional access the way other people hand out their phone number, they end up walking around with a body full of other people's unprocessed pain, with almost nothing left over for their own life. The empaths who finally find peace are the ones who start asking a quiet, private question before they let someone in. Does this person handle what I give them with care? Not do they love me? Not have we known each other for years? Not would it be rude to pull back, but specifically when I'm vulnerable, fragile, tired, or struggling, what do they do with that? Some people take what you give them and hold it gently. They don't use it against you later. They don't repeat it as gossip. They don't weaponize your soft moments during an argument 3 months down the line. And some people take what you give them and either drop it carelessly or use it as ammunition. An empath who becomes selective isn't being paranoid by noticing the difference, they're being accurate. Here's the part that's genuinely psychological and worth sitting with. High sensitivity makes you a brilliant emotional reader of other people, but it can also make you painfully slow to read the danger in your own relationships because you're so busy feeling what they're feeling that you forget to check whether what they're doing with your feelings is safe. Selectivity is the correction for that blind spot. It's the empath finally turning some of that perceptive energy back toward themselves and asking, wait, is this actually good for me? So they start narrowing the circle, not out of bitterness, not out of one bad breakup or one betrayal, but out of self-preservation that's been earned through pattern recognition. They notice who shows up consistently versus who only shows up when they need something. They notice who asks how they're doing and actually waits for the real answer versus who asks as a formality on the way to talking about themselves. They notice who can sit with silence and discomfort versus who needs to fix, minimize, or rush past anything heavy. And slowly, the list of people who get the real version of them, the unfiltered thoughts, the late-night doubts, the version that cries or doubts or admits fear, gets shorter. Not because they have less love to give, because they finally understand that love without discernment is just exposure. What's interesting is what this does to their solitude. Once an empath has been truly selective about who they let in, being alone stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like relief. Because the alternative to solitude was never deep, mutual, safe connection with everyone. It was shallow connection with people who didn't actually meet them where they were. Being alone is simply better than being surrounded by people who only get the surface version of you while draining the parts underneath. Once you've felt the difference between performing closeness and actually experiencing it, going home to silence after a long day stops feeling sad. It feels like setting something down that was never yours to keep carrying. This is also where empaths quietly learn the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is being around people and still feeling unseen. Solitude is being alone and still feeling whole. Selectivity is the bridge between the two. Because once you only let in the people who actually see you, your alone time stops being a retreat from people and starts being an extension of the same peace you feel with the few who are allowed close. And that's the quiet power of becoming selective. It doesn't shrink your life. It protects the only part of you that was ever truly worth protecting in the first place. Before anyone says a single word, an empath already knows something is off. They feel it in the way a room changes the moment a certain person walks in. They feel it in the pause before someone answers a simple question. They feel it in a text message that says, "We're fine," but somehow doesn't feel fine at all. This is the part of being an empath that most people never fully understand. It isn't intuition in some mystical sense. It's pattern recognition running so fast and so constantly that it feels instant. And for years, most empaths don't trust it. They override it. They tell themselves they're imagining things, overreacting, being too sensitive. So they ignore what their body already knows and wait for the words to catch up. Usually the words confirm what they felt 20 minutes earlier. Usually by then, the damage is already done. This is the real cost of not acting on energy the moment you sense it. You spend your life feeling things accurately and then doubting yourself anyway. You feel the tension in a friend's voice and decide to wait and see. You feel a relationship shifting and decide to not make assumptions. You feel your own body tightening in a conversation and push through it because leaving would seem rude or dramatic or premature. And every single time you override what you felt in favor of waiting for proof, you teach yourself the same lesson, that your perception isn't reliable enough to act on. Over time, that lesson becomes exhausting because you're essentially living two lives. One life where you sense the truth immediately, and another life where you wait for permission to believe it. What changes everything is when an empath finally stops treating their sensing as a maybe and starts treating it as data. Not proof, not certainty, but real, usable information that deserves a response, the same way pain deserves a response. You don't wait for a doctor's note to pull your hand off a hot stove. You move first and you understand later. Empaths who finally find peace in their own company learn to apply that same logic to people in rooms and situations. They feel the shift in someone's energy, and instead of staying to investigate, explain, or smooth it over, they simply adjust. They might leave the gathering 10 minutes earlier than planned. They might end the phone call gently instead of pushing through forced conversation. They might choose not to walk into a room that already feels heavy before they've even opened the door. This is not avoidance. This is the opposite of avoidance. It's responsiveness. Avoidance is refusing to feel something. What an empath does once they trust themselves is feel everything immediately and then move, instead of feeling it and freezing in place out of fear of seeming rude or impulsive. There's a kind of quiet bravery in that. Most people need an argument, a slammed door, a clear and undeniable reason before they'll change their plans or remove themselves from a situation. An empath who has learned to trust their reading of energy doesn't need the argument. They feel the temperature change in the room, and that's enough. They don't need someone to confirm it with words, because the truth always arrives in the body first and in the mouth second. This is also where solitude starts to feel less like retreat and more like intelligent self-management. Because once you stop waiting for confirmation before responding to discomfort, you spend far less time stuck in situations that were already wrong before anyone said so. You leave earlier, you disengage sooner. You stop investing hours of energy into relationships or rooms that were quietly telling you, from the very first 5 minutes, that something wasn't right. And the natural result of trusting that instinct consistently is that you simply end up spending more time by yourself. Not because you're hiding, but because you stop overriding the early warning signs that used to keep you stuck in draining situations far longer than you needed to be. There's something almost protective about this shift, like finally putting on armor you didn't know you were missing. Instead of being the last person in the room to notice the mood has changed, you become the first person to act on it. Instead of staying 20 minutes too long in a conversation that turned cold, you leave at the exact moment your body tells you to. Instead of doubting the tightness in your chest until someone confirms with their words what you already knew, you let that tightness be the signal it was always meant to be. This is the quiet skill that protects an empath's peace more than almost anything else. Not the ability to feel things deeply, which they already had, but the willingness to trust what they feel before anyone confirms it out loud. Because the world will always be slower with its words than your body is with its truth. And the empath who finally listens to that truth in real time is the one who stops getting hurt by what they somehow always knew. Most people think connection means staying available to everyone, all the time, just in case. They keep loose plans with people they don't really want to see. They answer messages out of obligation rather than desire. They show up to things hoping their presence will be enough to avoid the discomfort of saying no. For an empath, this kind of obligatory connection is uniquely costly because they don't just go through the motions like everyone else can. They feel every motion. They feel the forced laugh in a conversation that's running on autopilot. They feel the gap between what someone is saying and what they actually mean. So when an empath spends their energy on connection that exists only because it's expected, they're not just wasting time, they're being quietly worn down by something that was never real in the first place. For years, most empaths don't realize they have a choice here. They think connection only comes in one form, the kind that's offered to you, that you accept because turning it down feels rude, ungrateful, or cold. Family gatherings you dread but attend anyway. Friendships that have outlived their meaning but continue out of history rather than present-day truth. Plans made weeks ago that no longer reflect how you actually feel today, but you go anyway because canceling feels like a betrayal. This is connection by default, not chosen, just inherited, maintained out of habit and guilt rather than desire. What changes everything is the moment an empath starts asking a different question before saying yes to anything social. Do I actually want this, or do I just feel like I should? That question seems small, but it quietly rewires an entire life. Because once you start being honest about the difference between wanting and obligating, you start noticing how much of your social life was built on the second one. You realize how many dinners you attended out of guilt, how many conversations you had because leaving felt impossible, how many relationships you maintained simply because ending them felt like more work than continuing them half-heartedly. This is where empaths start replacing quantity with intention. Instead of staying loosely connected to 20 people through obligation, they choose to be fully present with 3 or 4 people through desire. Instead of saying yes to every invitation to avoid disappointing someone, they start saying yes only to the things that genuinely call to them. And saying no, clearly and without guilt, To everything else, this isn't coldness. It's the opposite of coldness. Because the energy they save by removing obligatory connection doesn't disappear. It gets redirected into the relationships they actually chose. The friend who gets a real, undistracted phone call instead of a tired 5-minute check-in squeezed between other plans. The partner who gets a fully present evening instead of someone running on emotional fumes from 3 other obligations that day. There's a psychological shift that happens here that's worth naming directly. Obligation creates resentment, even when you don't notice it building. Every time you show up somewhere you didn't want to be, some small part of you registers it as a loss, a piece of your time and energy spent on something that didn't serve you. And multiply that by years, and you get an empath who feels chronically depleted by their own social life, without ever understanding why, because on paper, they were just being a good friend, or staying close to family. But chosen connection works in the opposite direction. Every time you show up somewhere because you genuinely wanted to be there, it adds something back. The exhaustion that used to follow social interaction starts being replaced by something closer to nourishment, simply because the connection was real instead of performed. This is also why empaths end up spending more time alone once they make this shift, not because they've become antisocial, but because they've stopped filling their calendar with connection that was never actually connecting them to anything. Solitude starts to look less like the absence of people and more like the space that's left over once you've removed everything fake. And in that space, the relationships that remain become sharper, deeper, and far more meaningful, because they're no longer diluted by a dozen obligatory others competing for the same limited energy. The empath who finally learns this doesn't become harder to reach. They become more honest about what reaching them actually requires. They stop performing closeness with everyone and start reserving real closeness for the people who've earned it and the moments that genuinely call for it. And once connection becomes something they choose rather than something they owe, solitude stops feeling like a fallback option. It becomes the quiet, deliberate space they return to on purpose, not because no one wants them, but because they finally know exactly who and what is worth showing up for. There's a difference between a house and a sanctuary, and most people never notice it because they've never needed the distinction. A house is just a place where your things are kept. A sanctuary is a place where your nervous system finally exhales. For an empath, that difference isn't a luxury. It's a survival mechanism, because the rest of the world rarely offers them a space where they don't have to manage anyone else's energy, mood, noise, or need. So eventually they realize something simple but life-changing. If no one else is going to build that space for them, they have to build it themselves. This usually starts small, almost without realizing what's happening. An empath starts noticing which rooms in their own home actually calm them and which ones quietly drain them, even when no one else is around. They notice that certain lighting makes their shoulders drop, while other lighting keeps them subtly on edge. They notice that a cluttered space leaves their mind cluttered too, while a clean, simple space lets their thoughts finally settle. Most people walk through their environment without ever questioning its effect on them. An empath, once they understand themselves, starts treating their environment like it matters just as much as their relationships do. Because it does. What makes this sanctuary so powerful isn't really the furniture or the color of the walls. It's what the space represents: a place with no performance required, no managing someone else's reaction, no reading the room for tension, no bracing for a mood shift the second someone walks in. In that space, an empath can finally stop scanning. Their body, which spends most of its time in a low hum of vigilance, picking up on tone, energy, unspoken feelings, finally gets permission to power down. And most people who aren't highly sensitive can't fully grasp how exhausting that constant scanning is until they watch someone who's been doing it their whole life finally stop. But the sanctuary isn't only physical, it's emotional too, and this part matters even more because you can have the most peaceful bedroom in the world and still carry chaos into it if your inner world hasn't its own quiet space. Building an emotional sanctuary means an empath starts protecting certain hours, certain rituals, certain moments that are entirely theirs, untouched by other people's demands or even their own inner critic. It might be 10 minutes of silence before checking a phone. It might be a walk with no destination and no one to update afterward. It might be journaling, not to solve anything, but just to let the thoughts land somewhere outside their own head. These rituals aren't indulgent. They're maintenance. They're the equivalent of charging a battery that everyone else around them has been quietly drawing from all day. What's interesting is how this sanctuary changes the way an empath shows up everywhere else. Because once they have a reliable place to return to and recharge, they stop needing other people or other environments to provide that regulation for them. They stop walking into rooms hoping someone else will create the calm they need. They stop staying in relationships or jobs or friendships longer than they should, simply because they have nowhere else to release the pressure that builds up. The sanctuary becomes the foundation underneath everything else. The quiet, private place that makes it possible to be generous, present, and open everywhere else, because they're not running on empty anymore. This is also where solitude stops being something an empath apologizes for and starts being something they protect fiercely, almost the way you'd protect a savings account you depend on. They stop letting people casually drop by unannounced. They stop saying yes to plans that would eat into their one evening of real recovery. They start treating their alone time with the same seriousness other people treat a doctor's appointment or a work deadline, non-negotiable, because they understand exactly what happens if they skip it too many times in a row. The version of them that shows up to the world starts depending entirely on whether the version of them at home got what they needed. And maybe this is the deepest truth underneath all of it. An empath who has built a real sanctuary isn't running away from the world. They've simply stopped expecting the world to be the place where they heal. The world is loud, unpredictable, full of other people's unprocessed feelings landing on their shoulders without warning. The sanctuary is the one place that doesn't ask anything of them. And once they have that, solitude is no longer the opposite of connection. It's what makes real connection possible in the first place. Because the empath who has somewhere to come home to in every sense of that phrase is the only version of themselves capable of truly showing up for anyone else at all.